My name is John Hare. I'm the CEO of Immunomed Inc. and I'm going to walk you through this slide deck. First slide basically just talks about the company itself. Immunomed stands for immunity medicine. Basically we call microbiome immunotherapy. We are the only company doing this. We've targeted specific gut bacteria, initially in animal models and now on the human side to treat C. difficile infection. Slide 2, we're going to talk about C. difficile. You may not have heard of that bacterial infection. Infects 500,000 people in North America every year, kills about 30,000 of them. Problem right now is it's treated, as most bacterial infections are, by an antibiotic. We're now down to just 2 different antibiotics, and they work successfully between 60 and 75% of the time. When they don't work, you get what they call recurrent infections, or the patient unfortunately dies. The limitations of the current treatments are antibiotic resistance. As I said, we're down to 2 treatments right now that are still working. That's vancomycin and fidaxomicin. They, unfortunately, because they're also antibiotics, disrupt the gut microbiome, which makes it hard for the patient to recover because their gut microflora is what would normally keep C. difficile in check. And lastly, the main limitation is so far there is not a preventive treatment against C. difficile, even though Pfizer and Sanofi Pasteur have both tried to come up with vaccines and failed. We think we can use our antibody, a combination of the same antibodies we use for the therapeutic, to develop the first preventive treatment, which is where the biggest part of the market will be. Slide 3, the solution. We have 3 different treatments for C. difficile. The initial one, and what's going through phase 2 clinical trials right now, is our therapeutic treatment to go up against the present standard of care treatments, which are the antibiotics that I've mentioned. In our case so far, we've seen much better results from the point of view of getting people better. The second treatment is, one of the problems with C. difficile is you get what they call recurrent infections. When that antibiotic treatment doesn't work, and that's, like I said, it works between 60 and 75% of the time. So in other words, between 25 and 40% of the time it doesn't work. What happens then is the patient gets what they call recurrent infections. We have antibodies that could actually treat that. In other words, what we call an adjunct therapy would be used in conjunction with the vancomycin or the fidaxomicin standard of care treatment, and to the point where we would reduce recurrent infection completely. And finally, the third and really the best possible treatment is a preventive treatment against C. difficile. And right now there is no preventive treatment. And by the way, that's probably why a lot of people have never heard of C. difficile infection. Because what's the point of scaring a patient about C. difficile when there's no preventive treatment? Both Sanofi Pasteur and Pfizer have tried to develop a vaccine against C. difficile and both failed. The good news is they thought that preventing would be the best way of going about it. We know we can prevent C. difficile using a combination of the same antibodies we're going to use to treat C. difficile. Slide 4. So far, our data shows a greater than 90% success rate in treating C. difficile. And the nice thing about our treatment, very, very safe, no adverse effects like you get with antibiotic treatments. The mechanism basically is antibody treatments. Antibodies identify and neutralize pathogens. And in our case, we're targeting specifically C. difficile. There are 4 components of C. difficile that make you sick and cause it to recur, and we've targeted all 4. And finally, from our perspective that sets us apart, we have IP protection. In other words, we have patents in place for the therapeutic treatment issued in the United States, Canada, and the EU. Slide 5, market opportunity. We foresee a $2 billion revenue potential by the year 2030. The target populations initially is the therapeutic treatment, 500,000 patients in the United States alone, $4,500 per treatment. Recurrent infections, it would be worth, if the patient is taking the initial standard of care, which is an antibiotic, which we think we're going to supplant anyway, but in the meantime, take our adjunct therapy along with the antibiotic treatment, again, it would be $4,500, and you'll see no recurrent infections, which is one of the biggest problems with C. difficile right now. Is the patient can go on for many, many months with recurrent infections. And finally, the ultimate one is the infection protection, which I've listed number one on the slide here. Infection protection. C. diff is caused typically by somebody taking an antibiotic treatment for something else. You go into the hospital for knee surgery, they give you an antibiotic because they don't want you to get infected in that knee surgery. Unfortunately, the antibiotic you get for that disrupts the gut flora that you have, which is what otherwise would prevent you from getting C. difficile. You're in the hospital, C. difficile is prevalent in the hospital, you're susceptible because of the antibiotic treatment you've taken, and now you're sick with C. difficile, and that can set off a whole lot of other problems. In our case, you would now take our preventive treatment, which I think would be priced around $900. Anytime you are in a susceptible position, in other words, when you're going to go into a hospital for some kind of treatment, about half of the patients in every hospital right now are on antibiotics. So every one of them is potentially a patient or a customer. And the other thing, if you think about it, every time an antibiotic is prescribed, that person who receives that antibiotic is potentially susceptible to C. difficile. 270 million prescriptions for antibiotics are prescribed every year in the United States. A pretty big potential market. When we say growth drivers, obviously rising antibiotic resistance is a major thing, and that's called antimicrobial resistance, where the antibiotics that are supposed to treat bacterial infections are not working the way they used to. As a matter of fact, even in the short period of time that we've been working on this C. difficile, we're now down to vancomycin and fidaxomicin as the antibiotic treatments. Previously, when we first got into it, there was a treatment called metronidazole or Flagyl, and it's no longer even prescribed anymore because it doesn't work because of resistance. And so we don't have that problem. Secondly, the reason C. difficile is going to be more of a problem is aging population. C. difficile typically is more prevalent in people 65 plus. And the other thing, it's a hospital-acquired infection. And one thing that happens now is every hospital in the United States is gauged on their infection prevention. So if they haven't got a prevention against C. difficile, what they do is they try to clean as much as they can to make sure there's no C. difficile spores or bacteria in the environment that the incoming patient could access and get sick with. What happens is if their score goes over a certain amount, if their C. diff count is too high in the hospital, they actually get penalized, and the Medicare payments to them go down by the government. So obviously they're incentivized to keep their C. diff scores low. Obviously, if we have the only preventive treatment, that presents an automatic customer for us. It's the competitive landscape. Right now, obviously, the standard of care is vancomycin or fidaxomicin. As you can see, they work 60 to 70% of the time. Obviously, that means 20 to 30% of the time, or 20 to 40% of the time, they're getting recurrent infections. The dose is oral. Prevention, no. And fecal transplant. Now, FMT, fecal microbiota transplant, is used as a last resort to treat recurrent infection in patients with C. difficile. And that's, a matter of fact, the only time it can be used. There are now derivatives of what they call FMT, which they basically are taking the same bacteria that would be the ones that would be the probiotic type bacteria that are used in an FMT and putting it into a pill. Those can only be used after 3 failures of the antibiotic treatment. So, they can't be used as the initial standard of care at all, and they certainly can't be used as preventive. And then our therapy, we've been having 90% plus success, which obviously means recurrence less than 10%. It's an oral treatment, very safe, very easy to take. A glass of milk or milk substitute with a powdered mixture, drink it down, and that's your preventive treatment. Or your therapeutic treatment, either way. Slide 7. This talks about the regulatory pathways and sort of the milestones. And basically, right now we're in phase 2 clinical trial of our therapeutic treatment. Our intention is to complete phase 2 and phase 3 therapeutic treatments. We have budgeted a certain amount of money to do that. We're confident that once we've got those approved, that will generate the potential to get the same approval with the FDA. At the same time that we want to go ahead with that, we're going to start working on our preventive treatment, which we see as the highest revenue source for our treatments, and so we can get that started right away. And the nice thing about it, we've already determined that we can use the results we've had from our phase 2 clinical trial as a therapeutic, using the same combination of antibodies to work on the preventive treatment. So in other words, it's not a big deal to go back to Health Canada and the FDA and have them manipulate the trial to now say, okay, we're going to go preventive. And the nice thing about our preventive trials is it's not like a typical vaccine preventive. C. difficile is very, very targeted. You only get it when you've had an antibiotic treatment. You're more susceptible when you're 50 years of age and older. Most often it happens in hospitals, so we can really narrow down the actual population we need to test to show the efficacy of our preventive treatment. Our exit strategy is obviously the typical, small biotech. Getting returns is selling out to pharma that would, in our case, probably have a gastrointestinal component or infectious disease focus. Slide 8. We're looking for $10 million. And by the way, all numbers in this presentation are in US dollars. How we want to divide that up is we figure that 50% of that, in other words, $5 million, would be used to complete phase 2 and phase 3 trials. Now we've got the data we need to expand on that. We probably are suggesting 20%, in other words, $2 million, to get our preventive treatment ongoing, which we don't think will be a big problem. And we know that the actual clinical trial, we've already mapped that out with a protocol, doesn't require the typical vaccine trials, which, Pfizer, when they were doing their vaccine trial for C. difficile, they recruited about 17,000 patients. In our case, we probably need to recruit, because it's so refined as to those who will get C. diff, probably less than 1,000 patients in total. So obviously bringing the cost of doing that trial way, way down. So in other words, part of this $10 million will be getting that going as well. We need to gear up our manufacturing, need to produce some more product to do the phase 2 and phase 3 trials, and have some available so when we go commercial that we've got the antibodies available to sell. And then obviously we need money just for general operations and to do our regulatory compliance. We project $300 million in revenue by 2028, and that will be obviously selling as a therapeutic. And we presume that we're going to have our preventive treatment ongoing pretty quick. The one thing about C. difficile that's interesting with both Health Canada and the FDA is it's considered an unmet medical need. It's also, C. difficile, the bacteria itself, is what they call on the urgent threat list from the point of view of antimicrobial resistance. In other words, like I said earlier, we've already seen one of the antibiotic treatments that was originally prescribed to treat C. diff as not being there anymore. And so it's urgently needed new treatments for C. difficile because the antibiotics are no longer working. So we've got that in our favor as well. We expect that obviously when we get moving on this, partnership deals generating revenues, we anticipate of $100 million virtually within the first year and a half. Slide 9, and now we're just talking about the team. There's myself, obviously, and my partner, Dr. Pradeep Maiti. And Dr. Maiti, you can read about him here. We've been working on this technology really since 2005. We developed initially treatments on the animal health side. As a matter of fact, we have the first registered veterinary biologic using oral dose antibodies or microbiome immunotherapy to treat E. coli bacterial infection in baby pigs. So that was approved in 2007. So it's not like this is something that's never been done. Obviously, this is the first time with the C. difficile doing the same technology on humans. But Dr. Maiti has done all kinds of immunotherapies on monoclonal antibodies previously, and now he's walked us through basically all the technical details, and that's a lot, by the way, of our IP, of our regulatory requirements, and our lab that we're in. Everything has to be up to par. We have clean room lab inspected by all the various agencies that need to make sure that we're doing things the way they have to be done. So Pradeep has done a great job in that. My background, my background's animal agriculture. That's how we got started on this, and that's how we got that E. coli antibody treatment approved. And I also have an MBA, and so business experience in a lot of different areas. Slide 11, and that's basically, our vision is we see eradicating C. difficile as a problem. And one of the things, people don't realize that C. difficile is actually a big deal. Kills the same number of people as prostate cancer every year. Everybody knows about prostate cancer. Nobody knows about C. difficile. I mean, some people do, obviously. Everybody in healthcare knows about C. difficile. One of the reasons it's not out there, like prostate cancer, is there's no preventive treatment. So, in other words, you go into the hospital, and I was just looking at a survey that was done recently by one of the microbiome gut, health companies or organizations, and they did a survey on C. difficile specifically, and they asked people who had C. difficile, what was your biggest gripe about the infection itself? And almost every one of the people they interviewed said not knowing about it. In other words, when I went in for my knee surgery, or when I took an antibiotic for my ear infection, nobody told me that I might end up with C. difficile infection. And I don't blame anybody for not telling them, because there hasn't been until now a way of preventing it. In other words, that patient going into that hospital for knee surgery, had he known about the potential of the problems that he could have had by getting C. difficile, I think they would have been quite easily convinced to take a preventive treatment. Very specific timing on that treatment to keep them from getting C. diff at all. Same with when a doctor prescribes something for an ear infection. If they had something to tell the patient, yes, you might get C. difficile, but I can't do anything about it, and they had something otherwise like our preventive treatment, all of a sudden it takes a whole lot of pressure off of it, and all of a sudden you would also know about C. difficile a lot more than otherwise. Our long-term foresight is really that preventive treatment, because that's really where why would you want a patient to get C. difficile? It's typically a secondary problem, especially in the hospital. It just makes whatever your primary problem was way worse, and kills 6% of the people who get it. That's our story. That's our slide presentation. Basically, I said join us in transforming C. difficile care. Let's discuss terms.